everyone, and thank you again for having me here in this very interesting panel discussion. And I think I'll really learn a lot from here, and maybe the discussions here would be really fruitful for me in my work. I have, just to give you a background, my training is in political science, and so I'm very new, or rather a non-expert, so as to say, in the field of heritage studies. But I look at heritage as a field of contention, a field of political and social contention. The city that I study is in the western part of India, in Rajasthan. And it's a city which might be well known because it's a part of the golden triangle of tourism, which is Agra, Delhi and Jaipur. So I studied Jaipur, and you know it was a princely state, it is a princely city, and the royal buildings of Jaipur have been given a lot of importance. There are guidebooks, there's Lonely Planet, there are websites which would sort of advertise Jaipur as the princely city, the royal hub for excellence. And let's begin the story of heritage in Jaipur from there, because that has been the dominant, or rather the master narrative of history and heritage, which to my mind is a curated past in the context of Jaipur. So I look at heritage also as a product of the social, cultural and political tumors of the time when it comes into the foray, when it comes to the forefront, when it's defined as heritage, quote unquote. So a lot of work, if one looks at the contemporary lineage of heritage conservation in Jaipur, one can say that it begins from the late 1980s, rather the mid 1980s, when one project was launched by an American society, an American foundation, the Ford Foundation, which is well known. In 1985-86, they launched a project in Jaipur to delineate the historic buildings, to delineate the important structures, the built structures in the city of Jaipur, to make a list of that and to then fund the conservation of those buildings. And what came out of that report was that the buildings that were given importance were mostly the iconic structures of Jaipur. The Hawa Mahal, the city palace, the complex around that area, the Havelis, which were the mansions of the richer, the elite sections of society in Jaipur. So mostly the Jain and the Hindu Banya communities, which were the business communities of the city, even during the princely times, were given a lot of importance. And the reports that were published, not just by the Ford Foundation study, but even the second study that I want to quote here, which is the Asia Urbs, a European Union funded program, which was started in the early 2000s, 2001 to 2003, which also gave importance to precisely these very structures. So the first point that I'm trying to make is that there's a impetus and there's a lot of importance that's given to royal structures in the city of Jaipur, which are the structures of the elite in that particular society. The elites, the business community, the royal elites of the city, which have been given importance in the facade regulations, in the regeneration of heritage there. The second point, which is connected to this, is what is the use of conserving these important structures? What is the use of highlighting them, as it were, by repainting them, restoring them, because they look like highlighted structures. A lot of other structures look very faded, and we'll come to that, which I excluded from that larger master narrative of heritage. For instance, to give you one example, which I also observed during my field work, is the Muslim mohallas, the mohallas of Muslim craftsmen in different parts of the old city of Jaipur, which have not been given importance at all, compared to these more Hindu and the richer community structures like Havelis in another part of Jaipur. Right? So, which also brings us to the question of who is the spectacle being generated for? Why is there a politics of the spectacle? Because it seems, at least in the context of Jaipur, because every context may have its own story and its own narrative of heritage, but in the context of Jaipur, it feels that it's the spectacle. And what can we see? And also borrowing the colonial categories, which we see in a lot of government reports, like picturesque, colorful, vibrant. These are some of the adjectives which are used in several reports till today to describe Jaipur, including the reports of the Jaipur Development Authority, which is a government body looking at the extension and development of the city. So why do we use these categories, and for whom are we creating this spectacle? Now, the third related point is, I mentioned Ford Foundation, the European Union program, which was called the Asia Urbs program, which was to create a partnership between the European cities, small European cities like, let's say, Leicester City, Lyon in France, and other smaller cities in Asia. So Jaipur was one of those cities which were earmarked by the Asia Urbs program of the European Union in the early 2000s for restoration, for heritage restoration and revitalization of the walled city. This was the title of the project. Now in this, what becomes interesting to see is the funding agencies. Why are they funding these projects? So to talk about Ford Foundation a bit, there's a political economy, political economic rationale which I would like to bring here, which is that was the context when the Cold War was, it was the last stage of the Cold War, the mid-1980s, the late 1980s. That was the time when there was a lot of stake from the part of America and, scholarly interest of various agencies to know about the developing countries, to create a knowledge complex, as it were, about the developing countries, the life there. So a lot of studies were being funded, and I think I would place the heritage restoration of that particular period in that larger logic of knowledge production about the third world, the developing countries, in that particular context. But when we come to early 2000s, it can't be the same logic perhaps. The logic would change, the rationalities would change. And this is the context, the early 2000s is the context when 74th Constitutional Amendment has already been passed in India. A lot of changes have taken place in terms of, what should be done with urban spaces, and there's a decentralization of governance which has been recommended. So municipal bodies become very, very important. They have to now generate their own resources. This is also, if you remember, the time when liberalization of our economy has already taken place. So this is the time when cities are also sort of scrambling for resources. They're looking for funding. Like right now our universities are looking for such funds. Cities also similarly were placed in a predicament where the state funding was becoming less and less, but they had to develop themselves through other sources of funding. And perhaps that's where one can also look at why this interest in heritage. Now many cities are vying for heritage statuses. Jaipur was one of the latest entries into the list of UNESCO heritage city, the walled enclave of Jaipur. And it's interesting, and this is what sort of made me question too, why this excitement about preparing reports after reports on heritage. And not to say that it's wrong to prepare those reports, but there has to be something which makes a lot of cities participate in this process. And one would think, and one sees that the cities which are participating in these processes, one of the markers of the cities are, not all those cities are metropolitan cities. A lot of them are tier 2 cities. In fact, the government has launched a program, the Modi government in their last regime had launched a program called Hriday, which was for heritage revitalization of Indian cities, and a lot of cities which were sort of again marked out for that program was tier 2 cities in India. So the logic of it also could perhaps be to generate resources in the neoliberal context of our economy where we want funding, but we don't have funding from the state, so we have to look at funding from the private, the funding agencies, international banks, ADB, Asian Development Bank, European Union through the Asia Urbs program. Yes Bank has an institute which is just for culture and heritage, and they have organized in tandem with Intact Delhi. They have been organizing a lot of walks around Delhi. So it's again very interesting to see the funding and the lineages of heritage in contemporary times in that particular regard. And the other point which I think a lot of us have been talking about, which is a very, very important point, is the question of whose heritage is it? Who owns, who claims? And this is a question raised by Devadatta too in his introductory remarks. Who are the claimants of this heritage? Now if one looks at the reports which were published by the agencies, by the funding agencies and their recommendations, one of the recommendations that stood out for me were the rent regulations needed to loosen up, so that areas where ownership, and a lot of old cities which have been existing for centuries might not have clear-cut ownership claimants or ownership rights to all the people. Like, it's not a very neat and clean space in terms of legality. There is a messiness there. There are buildings, let's say old buildings, even in a city like Calcutta, we know, there are old buildings where people are living for generations and they don't really pay much to live there because there were rent regulations and rent control acts there, which also made these places accessible to the urban poor. So a lot of these people if one thinks of, if one actually adopts a lot of these regulations, which we need for heritage conservation, because until you have ownership, who will you call for meetings from these buildings? Who will you tell, who will you really mark out as people who have to be called from the civil society, from that neighborhood, from that community to come and participate in the process of heritage conservation? It becomes very difficult because there are people who are also living perhaps without quote-unquote ownership titles, but there are people who have those ownership titles who are fighting for it. So it also brings to the question, it also brings, amidst us the question of ownership, which is fraught with contention, the question of property, how heritage conservation might also be seen in the light of a certain politics, a certain process which would push speculative regimes in cities and make old cities the reservoir of capital. Because new cities, we know about the SEZs in different parts of India, the special economic zones. We know about enclaves like Gurgaon, which were earlier rural areas converted to urban areas. We also know of Rajarhat, closer to us. We know of these stories, and we know of the suburbs developing as enclaves of capital accumulation. But when we think of old cities, which are very densely packed with people, with buildings, we don't really think of them as worth speculation kind of resources, because you can't just raise them to the ground, right? One needs to think of them and revitalize them. So I also see the logic of revitalization within this larger political economic logic of speculation in urban spaces today. And I think it is important now, why analyze or why overanalyze heritage? Because after all, we need to protect heritage, we all understand that, but unless and until we also try to understand the politics, the rationale, whether it's the political economic, whether it's the political or social contentions around resources, unless we try to be sensitive and get sensitized towards these larger processes which are at work today, perhaps we would be, looking at heritage in a very blinkered manner. So here I would rest my case, and perhaps if I have one more, minute, I'll end the presentation with the story of one community, because there has been a lot of talk about belonging, and people have to prove their belonging to a place, to a space. In Jaipur, there has been a contention between the heritage lobby, and that also is not just, the funding agencies or the consultants or political elite, but it's also a lot of people at the local level, at the neighborhood level, who represent certain political parties also. So it is a very politicized realm. A lot of them had gone to the High Court of Rajasthan to demand eviction of certain shops around the walls in the city of Jaipur, because Jaipur is the walled city, some part of the wall is still intact. And if you have visited Jaipur, you know the touristy areas, the Bapu Bazaar, Nehru Bazaar area, which sell a lot of crafts, local crafts of the city, and tourists go there. So a lot of those areas were under the purview of the court order, which came out around 2015, which said that the shops were not within a stipulated limit from the wall. They were beyond 15 meters. They were, very close to the wall. So they were endangering the wall. And these shops, incidentally, were owned by the refugee groups that had come to the city of Jaipur after partition in the 1970s, which are the Sindhi refugees. These are Hindu refugee groups. When they came to the city, they were given these places after a lot of negotiation with the then governments to set up their shops, and they were called Purusharthis, hard-working people and the entrepreneurs of sorts. When they got those shops, they happily built their shops there. They, when they got those plots, they built their shops. They became tourist hubs. And suddenly now, with the court order of 2015, they feared eviction. So which also brings to the forefront the contention among people themselves on what is old, what needs to be saved by us, but who are these other claimants coming to the city and making the city into this, hub of tourism, but ironically they are also not seen as the original residents. So with this, I'll rest my case, and perhaps you can bring up some of these points during discussion. Thank you.